Welcome to the Dylan Experience. Today is episode 42. I'm your host, Dylan Sessler, and today we're going to be talking with a very special guest today. There is one thing I need you to do before we get into that, and that is follow, subscribe, like, hit the bell notification wherever you're following. Do all the things that matter there. Now, today, my guest has a remarkably profound story, one of hardship, confusion, and most importantly, one that showcases the true indomitable will for a human being to survive and continue to work through adversity. In the 2000s, my guest found himself gaining a lot of weight to the point where he maxed out at 340 pounds. He followed a number of different programs to get himself down to 280 pounds, but in 2009, it all seemed to be for nothing. He found himself on permanent medical leave because he was thought to be passing out randomly. It turns out his heart was stopping randomly and was found to be clinically dead more than a dozen times. Now, I won't spoil too much of this story so he can tell you in his own words, but he is currently writing his memoir, The Summer I Died 20 Times, which says a lot to you. I'm excited to share with you Fred Rutman. Fred, how are you?
I'm great, Dylan. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Fred, you got to start with a story. There's so much more. I could give you a 4 or 5 minute bio and still not even get close to what this story has in store for you. So do me a favor and do my audience a favor and give me an understanding of what happened, right? Give me the context, give me where you went, and kind of bring me up to where you are today and what you're dealing with now.
Okay, I think I'm going to go into the way back machine.
Yeah.
And we're going to start when I was born. And I didn't learn about this until I was in my mid-30s, but the doctors believe I had a stroke just before or just after I was born. And,
wow.
I'm just from that era when, teachers didn't recognize things, parents didn't recognize things. And I had a whole bunch of mental and physical impairments that just weren't addressed, even acknowledged.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know I was fighting a whole bunch of battles that needed to be fought until my mid-30s.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Sure.
Did you ever have feelings, right? No one ever told you, but did you ever have feelings of like, there's something wrong in here?
Yeah, for sure. I knew things were wrong with me. Like, I knew I was legally blind in my left eye, but no doctor ever could tell me why. Your eye is perfect, but yet you can't see out of it.
Weird.
So I'd get, and then there's no follow-up or anything like this.
Yeah.
I knew there was something wrong with the entire left side of my body, but I could never articulate it. I knew my memory was different than everybody else's, but who do you take that to?
Right.
And say, my memory is different than yours. Well, of course it is.
Yeah.
So, what I've learned since is I have no ability to visualize. So it's very difficult for me to retain visual clues.
Interesting.
So, if I said to the average person, I want you to visualize your favorite ice cream cone and see it dripping down the cone and onto your hand. And, I can't even do a stick figure version of that.
Wow.
And it leads into a whole other things like face blindness. If your audience is familiar with that, you see somebody, and you just don't recognize them, even if they just do a minor adjustment to the way they look or the setting you're seeing them in.
Sure.
I used to work for a financial services company, and I would spend 2-3 hours with a couple at their dining room table and have deep conversations with them about their family and their finances. If I saw them 20 minutes later in the mall, I'd have no idea who they were.
Wow.
And then, some factoid would come up, and they'd mention where they lived or that crazy lamp they had. That sort of stuff I seem to remember.
Yeah.
but who they were, I mean, yeah, it's torturous going through life like that.
Absolutely. I can imagine. I can imagine how
Mhm.
difficult that would be. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, yeah, keep going with the story if you don't mind. I just really wanted to understand that a little bit more.
Sure. Um, so when I was my mid 30s, my life was going nowhere fast. And my sister started hanging out with this woman who was doing a PhD. And this woman, I forget her name, her husband ran a clinic for people with learning disabilities or brain impairments. And she suggested I go there and get tested. And that's how I found out that I have what's generally described as a right hemisphere dysfunction. And I forget the exact number, but my right hemisphere was performing at less than 50% of what it should have been. So, your hemispheres work opposite in
Yep.
your body. So the right hemisphere explained why my left side of my body wasn't working. And that's called hemiparesis. So paresis being paralysis,
Sure.
hemi being half. So people get this one of two ways. Either they get it like a vertical split like I have, or a horizontal split like upper and lower.
Interesting.
So yeah. So so I went through a whole bunch of treatment with this doctor and it helped a lot. But we're dealing with what they knew in the 1980s, which
Yeah.
also wasn't a lot. And I made a lot of progress from not being able to go to university to being able to get an MBA in finance and marketing. So it made a huge difference in my life, but I had no idea how much more I had to grow to get back to the, I guess, level playing field. And then I'm going to fast forward to 2009, when this current adventure started. And as you mentioned, the doctors thought I was passing out randomly and misdiagnosed me for a number of months until they finally figured out that I was actually dying. My heart was stopping. So your heart stops, your blood pressure goes to zero, you have no blood and oxygen in your brain, you collapse, and you hit your head on whatever is the hardest object in the universe in the immediate vicinity.
Yeah.
So I sustained a bunch of concussions, which just layered onto the existing brain damage I had. And it got worse. And they finally figured out what was going on. It has something called a full heart block, which is all about the electrical system in your heart. And it sends the little pulses to tell your atria and your ventricle to bump, to beat and sync,
Mm-hmm.
and supply your body with what it needs. That system was dying in me. And so those signals weren't going through anymore. And thus my heart would stop. So I was clinically dead 20 times that we know of, that we have on record. Clinically dead means your heart isn't pumping and you haven't taken any breaths for 30 seconds. Some definitions have it at 60 seconds, but so yeah,
I feel like 30 seconds is long enough to be pretty bad.
Yeah. So we had a couple like 3 to 5 minute episodes because I was on an ECG type of monitor. So we actually had strips so that's getting into serious brain damage, not even factoring in the concussion parts. So what's amazing from all this is never once was I given an MRI or a CAT scan or any sort of neurological assessment, even though they knew I was getting the shit beat out of me.
Yeah. Right.
And I was so battered that, you really lose the ability to advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
And, being a combat vet, I guessing you see a lot of this as well.
Yep.
And you don't even know what to ask for,
right,
or who to ask for help, because there's really no roadmap for anything like this. If you want to
Yeah,
If you
especially
want to
back
have
then.
yeah, if you break your leg, they know how to put a plate in there. For this, they really don't know, and they're just starting to scratch the surface. And I had to rely on my own intuition to try and start healing. I'll tell you how badly my brain was battered. I've been learning Hebrew since I was 5. And so I come from the Orthodox Jewish world. And, you do your daily prayers 3 times a day. When my friends brought my prayer book to the hospital, I started to do my prayers. I could no longer read Hebrew. Like, it knocked an entire language out of my head.
Have you since retained that, or is that still?
It's come back, but it's much weaker. I mean,
Yeah.
I lost a lot of everything
Wow.
back then. So I lost language. I started slurring my words. I had depth perception problems, balance problems. I wasn't great at nonverbal skills before that. And I'd made a lot of progress, but it went back to, close to the starting point.
Right.
And there's just, there's an anxiety that runs in the background that's always there.
Yeah.
And it, because you don't know when you're about to drop dead.
Right.
And then they gave you, they gave me a pacemaker to correct this, but then there were problems with the pacemaker.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to be protected, but you're not protected anymore.
Right.
So it's just constantly churning in the background.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
can't even imagine, and not only that, but like your inability to kind of communicate this stuff started so early on because of that potential stroke, either before or after your birth, right? Of, you had problems, you felt like you had problems, but how do you express that to adults when you can't even, you know, bring to bear words and vocabulary at such a young age to express that stuff, right? That's
Mhm.
that's the challenge in many ways, that ultimately really what I see leads to such difficulties expressing yourself at older ages, is that you never had the words early on. And if you never get taught the words, if you never get taught the, how to express this stuff, the emotional expression, if you get um, in some ways suppressed by other people, right?
Mhm.
You get told, hey, there's nothing wrong with you, right?
Mhm.
But your body's like, yeah, there is. There's definitely something wrong with me. Like, how do you tell that adult that just told you what you should feel, that you feel different? And
Mhm.
that kind of stuff, I can imagine, obviously with everything else you had going on before this stuff, how difficult it would have been, especially with my own experience as a combat vet, right? It was hard enough without brain injuries to express what
Mhm.
I had going on. And I can't even imagine how much more complicated that gets when you have that brain injury and you have that history of not being able to understand how to actually express the very issues that you've had. It's hard. It's extremely hard.
Yeah, it's also exhausting.
Yeah.
And when you're exhausted and you don't even know you're exhausted because you're not really good at identifying your own feelings and emotions,
Yeah.
um, people will see you as just acting out.
Yeah.
So I remember trying to learn script, and I was at a parochial school, so we do half a day Hebrew, half a day English, and a lot of the Hebrew teachers were former IDF. So
Yeah.
they're all battle hardened people,
Yeah.
and you can't write between the lines, and they're just like, you're not trying. Like, it never occurred to anybody that that there's something that's preventing you from writing between the lines.
Yeah.
So you're just getting drill sergeanted all day.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Makes
it
sense.
wasn't the best experience.
Yeah. And it makes sense why, like when you look back and hindsight's 2020, isn't it? But it's
Mhm.
also, it's also hard to be able to see that and recognize that's what I had to go through.
Mhm.
It's harsh in many ways.
Mhm.
Um, so you were around 2009, obviously. Um, you had all of this stuff happen. You got in some ways diagnosed. You got a pacemaker. Then what
Mhm.
happened?
Um, at that time, they also diagnosed me as type 2 diabetic,
Hmm.
which, most people don't even know if they're diabetic because there's no actual symptoms till the condition really digresses. And so they put me on like huge doses of insulin because my blood was apparently like corn syrup or something. So it was just too thick to move around. But apparently that's unrelated to what caused my heart issues. And they still don't know. One of the reasons they had such a hard time diagnosing it is it's a condition that usually presents itself in like 70-year-olds. So, I was in my mid 40s, so they weren't looking for it.
Sure.
And that's one of the challenges in our medical system is that doctors sort of stake out their territory
Hmm.
and that's what they're going to solve because they had tested me I don't know how many times for having a heart attack,
Yeah.
um, and they didn't get the results that said I had a heart attack, but they couldn't move off that space.
Yeah.
And they just kept testing me for it over and over again. And nobody said, hey, maybe there's something else we should be looking for.
Yeah.
And I think that's fairly common.
Yeah. I, what's interesting. I don't know if you've ever read the book, When the Body Says No.
No, I haven't.
I recommend it. And why I recommend it is for this reason. The book itself is about understanding one of what you're exactly saying is that these doctors have this tendency to, stay in their lane of, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, so I'm going to only look at joints or, how the body moves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you might have arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, but not know the cause, right? Because that cause is developed through, we don't know, right? Like then you have this idea where there's systems, because the body is a massive system. It's not just
Yeah.
bones, it's not just muscles, it's not just organs. It's a system. It's a complicated system, and this is what this book is kind of really trying to say. Um, and stress is really potentially the cause behind a lot of these things. And it makes me think of like how this book talks that from day one you were engaged in stress, right? You
Mm-hmm.
you potentially had a stroke before or after your birth. And so from that moment on, your body was in a constant state of stress. Your body's not designed to be in a constant state of stress for long periods of time. It's designed to
Mm-hmm.
engage in stress and then disengage in stress, right?
Right.
To reconcile and process these things. And if you are in a constant state of stress, I think When the Body Keeps the Score is another good book if you haven't read that. Um, when your body's in a constant state of stress, it creates overactive situations in which, you know, the stroke certainly had an impact on your right hemisphere, right? And then that put a certain amount of uh, pressure or overexertion on other pieces of your body that had to make up for your right hemisphere's uh, inability to work, right? And I'm no doctor, but like you kind of put the pieces together and start understanding that that puts pressure on everything else in
Mm-hmm.
in unsustainable categories, right? Unsustainable
Right.
situations. And so ultimately what that leads to is, weirdly enough, unanswerable questions about where did this come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
It leads to autoimmune disorders, things like diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, all of these physical ailments that kind of have uh, no beginning, and we don't understand where they come from necessarily. And it also, what the book talks about is also like this almost hyper conditioning of, I have to do what everybody else tells me because I don't even know how to operate myself, because my feelings are telling me one thing, but society's showing me another thing. And so that conditioning itself, like this is where, when the body says no actually comes into play, is that when you can't say no to people, your body says no for you. Because that conditioning of, I want to please people, I want to make people happy, but I feel like I'm the burden. And so we take on this responsibility of trying to help other people or do everything for other people or make other people comfortable. And we're exerting more stress and creating more internal issues to the point of our body slowly declines and falls apart, kills itself, more or less.
Actually, Joe Rogan just had somebody on the, I can't remember his name, Tyler. He's a former helicopter pilot, fighter helicopter.
Sure.
And he was expressing the same views.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of the people in the service are these people that just want to help and please other people. Otherwise, they're the burden.
Yeah. I think it's remarkably more common. I think you look at therapists, you look at psychologists, psychiatrists. Why did you get in the profession? Social workers, people that serve people essentially are going to potentially have this problem, right? And then when you add on complicated medical issues like yourself, it's only going to expand those problems. And I think it's not only an individual situation or issue, it's a societal issue. It's because we're creating this by having these expectations of, Fred, you need to be normal. Well, you fucking can't, right? Like,
whatever that means,
right? Like if I have this expectation of you being normal and I get upset when you're not, what does that do to you? Right? Like that's placing so much internal stress that you can't come out and say, Dylan, your version of normal is bullshit, right? Like you can't do that necessarily, because I might have 12 people that say the same thing to you. And then like, we're societal beings. It's like, if you're the one person that's out, right? You look at all the people that are in and you're like, I'm the problem.
Yeah.
And
I think with going off on too much of a tangent,
yeah,
our definition of what is normal has narrowed so much as a society that you're either side A or side B and almost nothing in between.
Yeah.
And that adds a whole nother layer of constant aggravation. I think the national pastime now is being disproportionately outraged at the smallest thing.
Yeah.
It's everybody's hobby.
It's a great way to put it. Yeah, absolutely. I think, national pastime is being a troll on the internet. Right?
Yeah.
It's
sad.
It's a struggle, and it's a real, I think it's something that we're going to be coming up against in the next decade I feel like we're going to start addressing that issue, because people are getting more and more annoyed with it, right? Like I see more and more discussion about it on, from influencers that are big, right? Where it has never really been a major focus for certain influencers. I think more and more people are just going to come out and be like, don't be a dick,
Yeah.
It's not
and
hard.
Stand up.
Yeah.
Throw another Joe Roganism out there from the same interview, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the guy's name. He said there's an old adage that hard men lead to there being easy lives.
Yeah.
Easy lives
lead
to weak men.
I've been talking about this a lot, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna pull up the quote real quick, but keep going with your thought.
And weak men lead to, real problems, and the real problems lead to the rise of hard and capable men again. It's a cycle, and we seem to be going through the weak men part of the cycle.
So hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And you know, I have almost a critical view of this quote in my mind, because it's you know, the idea is it sums up a stunningly pervasive cyclical vision of history. And so that's the premise of this, because it's from a post-apocalyptic novel. And I agree with it and I disagree with it, because
exactly,
we are in such an interesting moment in history where we have an unbelievable amount of self-awareness of ourselves, right? And so there's hard times for everyone, and there's good times for everyone right now, right? And when we have that self-awareness, is like we're looking at, potentially you could look at this and say this is a hard time in human history, right? You could also say, on the contrary, it's one of the best times in human history, because we have the most abundance, we have the most self-awareness, we have the most amount of access to information, to money, to medical care, food, water, all of this stuff that we've never had access to before at such a scale. And yet at the same time, one of the most important things is like, how do you define strong men and weak men? Because I think that definition very much is changing and transitioning as we speak. You know, I look at the service, right? I look at how the Army is changing right now. When I joined the military, I got punched in the chest by a drill sergeant. You could never do that now, right? And so does that make me a strong man versus what the Army's, you know, developing right now? I wouldn't say necessarily, because there's soldiers that I have now that are emotionally more resilient than I was in 2008 when I joined, because they have the ability to actually express their feelings because their parents actually taught them that.
Right.
I was never taught that. And so maybe physically I can handle more pain, but maybe emotionally they can handle more hardship. I don't know, you know? And so that idea of strong men versus weak men is a remarkably fluid conversation right now. And I don't think we really know how to define it.
No, and it'll change over time, and then you'll have freaks like Jocko.
So, yeah, right.
You know, who's just like the entire package.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know anybody who has listened to one of his podcasts or his interviews and said, oh my God, how can I not be like that guy? Or how can I be that guy? You know, that's their new life goal. But it's a phenomenon. But to further your point, if we had had this pandemic 30 years ago, it would have been so much worse. You know, our supply chains are so evolved right now, so computerized, so efficient, and they would have just collapsed.
Yeah,
even more than they have now. We wouldn't have been able to create the vaccines, and whether you agree that they're vaccines or not vaccines, we wouldn't have had the computing power to run the models and stuff like that. It's just a whole different scenario. It would have been a whole different level of hard.
Yeah. And imagine what it would have been like 30 years ago to implement a shutdown in some capacity, or like a lockdown or anything like that. It just would have been vastly different, right? I think access to the internet and access to social media has made this in many ways easier. There's absolutely an argument to say it's been harder. I also think it's made it easier, because I can do what I'm doing right now. I can call you via video and be like, hey, Fred, I'm struggling, right? I have access to people that 30 years ago I would have had to call or you know, would I've been afraid to call, or, you know, I couldn't have texted them back then. And, you know, like everybody has their own version of expression. And we have so many versions of expression available to us right now that I think that pandemic 30 years ago might have been a really painful awakening for some people of like, wow, this is what isolation is. This is
Mhm.
brutal.
Yeah, I think suicides would have been way higher. I mean, it's tragic that they got as high as they did, and the mental health issues would have been worse.
Yeah.
Um, so, and just more people would have died.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that was a long tangent, but I want to get back to your story if you don't mind. This is good. I love this. I have no problem with this. So I think you were right around, and maybe help me if I forget, but you were right around the time where you were already diagnosed with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. So their standard treatment for type 2 diabetes is that it's a lifelong chronic condition and you'll never get rid of it. There's no way to cure it. And we know that's not true now. We knew it then. So if you want to go into the conspiracy end of things, into Area 51, you know, so much of our lives are being driven by the pharmaceuticals.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know it can be cured because I have reversed my type 2 diabetes. And I'll tell you about that in a little bit. So I was figuring out how to recover from all this, you know, trauma, and I wasn't able to work. So I went back to my roots, and it was exercise, try and lose weight, and do whatever you can to keep your brain active, because those things always help. You know, exercise is rarely bad for you. Learning is rarely bad for you.
Mm-hmm.
Losing weight, rarely bad for you. So I did my best on my own to come up with my own systems. And I made a lot of progress. And then in 2013, the same thing started happening to me over and over again. I started randomly passing out, hitting my head, blah, blah, blah. And well, wait, I've got a pacemaker. The pacemaker keeps me alive. I'm 100% dependent on this pacemaker.
Yeah.
So if it stops, I stop. And I end up in the hospital again, and they can't figure out what's going on. And they realize that one of the leads, one of the wires from the pacemaker that takes the current to my heart, has cracked. So
Jeez.
usually if that happens, you know, there's sort of like a worldwide recall, like there's been a manufacturing defect and they'll, you know, have a couple of thousand of these around the world. No, I was the only one. Excuse me. So, you know, they again, they weren't looking for something like that because they had no notice, and they finally figured it out. And so they said, well, we've got to replace this. So I go in for the replacement surgery. And this is sort of like, you know, a Wile E. Coyote cartoon,
Yeah.
kind of like, finally, I think, you know, I got the Roadrunner caught, and then splat,
Right.
you know, again. So I go in for surgery, and it's a very cool little room. It's actually a lab as opposed to an operating theater. And they've got like this big scoreboard with all your vitals and everything. And the room is really cold. It's like 38 degrees.
Jeez.
Because they have to use this, I think it's called a fluoroscope, so that they can see inside your body as they're doing the surgery.
Yep.
And that gets really hot. So they have to keep you frozen. And I'm watching the monitors, and I'm getting very anxious. They didn't tell me they were pinning me down. They also didn't tell me that you're actually awake for the surgery now. They used to put you under general, and now it's just like going to the dentist. And so there's having trouble with this monitor, and they're, you know, we can't see your vitals. And I'm like, oh, I didn't like this before. I'm liking it even less now. And then they start to cut, and they also don't tell you they're now using a laser scalpel. So you're sitting there in a really anxious position, And then you smell your flesh burning as they cut you open. And then I know the feeling that happens when my heart stops. You get sort of like a little brain quake. I don't know if that's the brain like doing whatever it can to like keep me alive, keep me alive.
Yeah.
But I just remember saying, oh fuck, I'm gone. And then I was gone. I guess they had moved the pacemaker or something in this whole process, and it disconnected the wire again. And so I was code blue on the table. And you know, we all have these visions. I think this is also part of the problem in medicine, from watching all these TV shows and movies about how, you know, if there's a medical emergency, in 8 seconds, like every exact person that needs to be there is on scene, and every medication they need is on scene, and every medical device is on scene. It certainly doesn't happen like that. I've seen enough of these on both in the hospital wards and in my own situation. It's fucking bedlam. You know, people are screaming and swearing and they can't find things. And
Yeah.
so I didn't remember them putting these things called pacing pads on me. So as opposed to the defibrillators, which are one shock, this is something that just keeps shocking you as you go, to keep simulate your heart beating. And I come to, and I know the surgical report says it was like 12 seconds later, but it sure felt like a lot longer than that.
Right.
And you know, you're all disoriented. And I said, okay, I'm back. Like whoever's doing this CPR or whatever on me, you can stop. And, you know, somebody says, shut the fuck up. We're trying to save your life. And then somebody else says, no, keep talking so we know you're okay. And I'm like, well, whoever's making the decision, stop whatever you're doing to me. Because, you know, you're literally getting shocked. And it's like getting constantly kicked in the ribs.
Yeah.
It's really brutal. So eventually they decide they need to put in a temporary pacemaker. And they do that by threading a wire through your femoral artery. So that's your longest artery in the body, and they go up through your groin. So conveniently, nobody thought to bring one to the operating theater. So they had to go find it. So they're like, where is it? Well, it's in the supply closet. There's only 3,000 supply closets. Could you narrow it down, kind of thing? So somebody finally brings one back. And then the doctor said, well, where are the fucking leads?
No.
So they had to go back and get the leads and everything. In the interim, what they were supposed to have been doing is sterilizing my groin and putting some numbing agent in there. And they didn't.
Oh my goodness.
So when they went to insert this thing, scalpel, and like that hurt. It really hurt. And you know, it was not the smoothest operation. And then they took me back to ICU. And because they weren't sure how well they had put this temporary pacemaker in, I wasn't allowed to move for like 7 days because it could have popped out. And then after 7 days, they discovered I had no infection. So we were going to try again. So I said, hold on, you know, we're going to do things a little differently this time. You know, you're going to make sure that you don't use a laser scalpel. You're going to make sure I don't smell anything. You're going to give me some sort of sedation to get rid of all this anxiety. And, you know, possibly a different surgeon, please.
Yeah.
And so we went ahead with the operation. And these are, you know, they do like 800,000 of these a year. So it's a pretty common operation now. And it's supposed to take like 20, 25 minutes. And I notice I'm falling asleep in there and waking up. And then I wake up and I notice that the clock's moved like an hour and a half. I'm like, oh, crap. And I see the doctor, he's on a video call with other doctors around the world trying to figure out how to do something. And I say, what's going on? He says, never mind, we're trying to save your life. And so what it was is they couldn't thread the lead through the vein to get it into my heart. And they didn't tell me at the time. I learned subsequently, my vein had collapsed.
Jeez.
So they think, and this is more Area 51 stuff, that in my original 2009 surgery, something went wrong and the vein collapsed. And that's what led to the lead cracking and causing this subsequent mess.
Jeez.
So they eventually figured it out how, I don't know. And so stayed in ICU for a few more days and they release you to the world. Again, with no treatment plan.
Right.
There's like, nothing to address anything that's happened to you neurologically. It's kind of mind-boggling.
That's just, when I look at that, it's just, that's trauma. I mean, that's
Mhm.
medical trauma. Like that's one of those things that is quite rarely discussed nowadays in terms of like PTSD. It's like medical trauma, like
Mhm.
all of that. I mean, if I think I've been quite lucky. I've had 3 ACL surgeries, 2 reconstructions, and both surgeons walked me through the whole process beforehand without me even asking. Like I didn't even have to advocate for myself. They walked me through those surgeries. And obviously reconstructions are a lot more common and have been throughout the past 20 years than something like that, because they're just so common. But it just seems like good medical practice to say, this is what's about to happen to you, so you're prepared, right?
Mhm.
And give you some kind of choice in knowing that or not. It just seems like that's a good idea. And it's baffling to me, from my experience, because I've had good experiences, to realize that there's people out there going through such traumatic kind of situations as this, that people don't explain this to you beforehand.
Mhm.
That's traumatic. And
Yeah,
I mean,
I
living with that is, I can't imagine that's been easy to kind of process afterwards.
it hasn't been. And I don't want this to come across as me just bashing the medical industry, because it's a continuum, right? You get your,
Yeah.
superstars, and then you've got the
Yeah.
lower end of like, how the fuck did you get a job?
Right. It happens everywhere. You could bash any industry with that.
Yeah. So my current medical team, I've got like 6 specialists, are pretty top notch. But along the way, you just have to, my parents had a really hard life, and I guess I've got some of their overcoming adversity and, strong resilience gene.
Which is quite good for you.
And yeah, and I mean, nobody teaches you how to be resilient.
Nope.
We assume kids, when they go to school, that they know how to do homework. Most of us don't. I know I didn't. We know how to communicate well. We know how to apologize. I mean, it's just not a skill set that we put a premium on, and we probably should. We should probably also teach kids to do their taxes and manage money, but that's a whole other issue.
Right.
So I guess in that regard, I had this keep chugging along kind of personality and see where it gets me. And it was going okay until 2018. And this happened again. So, I've had like these 1 in a billion experiences that, the doctors really weren't prepared to look for them. And so it's not like, on the shows you see like House, where, you've got this super genius sitting there and, he's got his dedicated team. Most hospitals don't work like that.
Right.
And so I went in for surgery number 4, I guess. and they decided, screw the old pacemaker. We're just going to put in a whole new unit. So this one's, my initial ones are on the left side of my chest. We're going to go right side, put in the new unit, take the old unit out, and you'll be happy and healthy for another 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
So something happened during this surgery. I
course.
actually told them, I don't want to be awake for this. If you guys are going to kill me again, I don't want to know about it.
I feel like if people heard that out of context, they just wouldn't understand, but it makes sense. It makes so much sense. Yeah.
So we go for the surgery, and I like my pacemaker surgeon. He's a great guy. He's always accessible and very creative. And of course, so I don't remember the exact times, but say my surgery was scheduled for 1 p.m. And when I started to wake up out of the anesthetic, I noticed it was like 5:30 or 6. And again, 25-minute surgery, even in my dazed state, something didn't go right. And of course, something didn't go right.
Of course.
So,
Jesus.
So they couldn't install both of the leads that I needed to fully replace it. So I actually don't have an explanation as to why that happened, but it happened. So they had to figure out, well, how are we going to keep him alive? He obviously can't keep going with the one that keeps failing. Yeah. So they actually rigged up a system where when the original pacemaker craps out, the second one senses it and kicks in.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it is, but it's a system that takes a while to get refined because you have to keep playing with the sensors. So in the interim, I was still having these syncopes where this would stop, and then there might be like 3, 4, 5 seconds until this one would understand that and kick in.
Yeah.
So you still get these holy, crap, because your heart does stop for the 4 or 5 seconds. And again, that's just so unnerving because you don't know if it's going to kick back in.
Right.
And you don't know if you're going to fall or you're going to fall down the stairs. Can I drive? No. I mean, the doctors told me I could drive, but I said, I don't feel safe driving. I'm just going to ride my bike until you guys get this figured out. So it took probably like 3 years to get it dialed in so that it kicks in like immediately. So that's the adventure.
I mean, that's just so much. There's so much anxiety, a powerful anxiety with that. Like you are literally, you're 5 seconds away from death, and every single time, and like, it, like that's incredibly powerful and real. That has to be incredibly traumatizing in some way. Of like, even after those 3 years of kind of figuring things out, you probably still look back and are like, is it going to work? Like,
yeah,
I don't know. It may stop tomorrow. And it's gotta be hard.
Well, I'm going to put some icing on the cake.
Of course you are. I would expect nothing less from you at this point, Fred.
The original pacemaker that was replaced, the battery's almost dead. So within the year, I have to go in for another replacement surgery. So
let's hope this one is 25 minutes long and it's good.
Well, we can, but looking at the other side of things, I've still got a book to write.
Yeah, you do.
And the more of these misadventures that happen, the more book I have to write.
I was going to ask you about that with all of this stuff going on, right? Like, having that kind of right hemisphere issue, and having obviously all of these complications happening, how does that actually impact writing a book? I know, like for me, it's incredibly hard to just write a book, and I don't have all those complications and that, the brain injuries. I don't have that stuff, and it's hard enough for me to write a book. How does it impact you for writing?
That's interesting. Learning to keyboard was literally a game changer for me, because before that, when I had to write things out by hand, I was very stop and start and cross that out, and like writing essays was torturous for me in high school.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So now you can just cut and paste and organize your thoughts much more easily.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one big thing. The second thing is, it's not like I'm going through a creative writing process where I'm trying to originate ideas and flush them out. This is just when I have the appropriate memory, I can jot it down and then worry about making it grammatically correct or funny or tragic or dark or whatever. And I try and make the book a little bit humorous, because there is some pretty heavy, dark stuff in here.
Of course.
And it's a lot of it is just my memory that comes back in flashes. And also my therapist is an immaculate note taker. Like, she's probably got a stack of notes on me, this high. And so if I can't remember something, I can just go back to her and say, do you remember when? And stuff like that. I remember once asking her, what do you remember from when you first heard about my story? And she said, I was just amazed that you're any degree of functional at all. Yeah. Like, I've never heard a story like this. Right. And, that's a therapist who's been in the business for 30 years. Yeah. And even now, if I have something bothering me and I end up going to Emerge or something, because that's what the doctors say, you're in such a freaky position. If you think you've got a headache that's not normal, you go to emergency. Yeah. And I tell the doctors I have 2 pacemakers running simultaneously. They don't believe me. I was told once, I don't know if this is urban myth, hospital myth, that there's like 8 people in the world that are hooked up like me. And so doctors don't believe me. I'm like, you've got my file. That's another thing doctors don't do. They don't read the files.
Right.
Okay, go back to this date. You could say inserted second pacemaker. I'm like, no, I don't want to do it. So it's an interesting experience.
Yeah, it's crazy. Listening to the story, obviously you sent me a bio and I read through it and I'm like, this is nuts. But hearing you talk about it is just another level, right? Like, you're right. Like, there's nothing like this, right? There's nothing, and I suppose, like, when, going back to the original question of like writing, how does it impact writing? It makes a lot of sense now. Like, for my book, it wasn't just a memoir, right? My book there was more creative understanding, because I'm trying to help people understand how to overcome some of this stuff that you and I have gone through in different capacities. And I wasn't just writing a memoir. I was really trying to formulate creative ideas of, this is how I did it. This is how I've watched other people do it. And putting those two together takes a lot of effort. But having that memoir is actually, it would make sense. It'd be a lot easier to just, hey, this is what happened to me. So write down all the things that have happened to me. I've done that, and that is actually quite simple. I am curious, like, when do you think it'll be, finished?
It's sort of finished right now. It's sitting with the editor, and I have to raise some money to get the professional editing done and the artwork and stuff. So I'm not sure if I'm going to run a Kickstarter. I think I'm going to run a Kickstarter.
Sure.
Because if I had been working all this time, the money wouldn't be a problem. But I'm pretty financially depleted right now, so the money has to come from somewhere else. I had somebody who was going to fund it, and then COVID hit, and his business took a real hit, so he had to back out.
Yeah.
So somehow this is going to get published.
Absolutely, as it should.
And maybe it'll evolve into a speaking tour. And
I would hope
does
so.
this all tie into the question you're going to ask me at the end?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can speed up that process if you want. Like I feel like we've gotten through most of your story.
Yeah.
Is there anything else? I guess where are you now outside of the book? Like, what are you trying to kind of get to? What are your goals? What are you still struggling with? Where are you right now?
Well, I think I've got a clear purpose in life. So if you're a God-believing person, of whatever God you believe in, you believe, okay, once you have a near-death experience, whatever you want to call it, fine. You have like 30, 40, 50 of these. God's giving you a pretty clear message that you're not done yet. And you've got some purpose, and it's up to us to figure out what that purpose is, whether right or wrong. And I think my purpose is to tell my story and let people know they're not alone. We're all going to face some type of adversity. I might not be walking in your shoes, but I'm going to be walking in shoes right beside you to some degree. And we should try and draw strength from each other's adventures. There's nothing super special about me, despite what my mom says. And, if I can get through this, most people can hopefully get through their adventures. But mindset is so important.
Yeah.
And, you talked before about not knowing the root causes of so many of our illnesses. So I'm going to do a quick book promote here, if that's okay.
Go for it. Absolutely.
So before my last surgery in 2018, I went into my doctor's office, the cardiologist, and he walks in and throws this book at me, not this one, but another one called The Obesity Code by Dr. Jason Fung. And it's about intermittent fasting. So this current one, Fast, Feast, Repeat, is a New York Times bestseller by Jen Stevens. And I'd recommend that people look into this book. And of course, if you try intermittent fasting, always do so with the guidance of your medical professionals, because although I've had enough experience to be a doctor, I'm not actually a doctor. Yeah. So my cardiologist says, buy this book, read this book, do this book, after you get buy-in from all our other, medical team.
Sure.
And initially, people have known about intermittent fasting for hundreds of years. I mean, it's a very biblical thing. Most major religions have fasting components. What our current medical paradigm is on intermittent fasting is it's mostly for weight loss. And it is, but they're just starting to catch up to how it starts activating all these subsystems in your body that get rid of inflammation, balance your hormones, initiate all these epigenetic subsystems, and heal your body to unbelievable degrees. And I now attribute the large majority of my recovery to intermittent fasting. Things that the neurological healing. So you can go to people like Dr. Mark Mattson from Johns Hopkins, who talks about how intermittent fasting works on your nervous system, helps regenerate nerves, gets rid of scar tissue in the brain, replaces neural pathways that have been damaged and recreates them. It's fascinating stuff. And I could go on and on and on, but I know you only have a certain amount of time for the podcast.
Yeah. Well, I'll make sure there will be a link to that book in the description for people to people to check it out. I will check it out. But yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, Fred, this has been, it's incredible to hear your story, and it absolutely needs to be a
Thank
book.
you.
And so make sure you finish that. If there's anyone that has heard this story at this point, I'll make sure there's a link. By the time this comes out, I imagine you'll have either a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe to get this kind of kicked off, or at least I'll get you a link to find Fred, connect with him, and maybe, certainly a lot of people have helped me get my book off the ground. I imagine that there will be a lot of people that will be able to help you. If you're hearing this, it would be incredibly valuable to have your book and your legacy left behind for whenever it is you put it out there. So I hopefully someone hears this and is able to help you out with that. I hope it is. That's the case. But I got to ask you a question before we call this done. If there was one message you could leave the world, Fred, what would it be?
Joy is comparison is the thief of joy. Probably heard that before. And joy is not like our current supply chain. There is no finite supply of joy. It's out there for you to grab. And the more joy you can put into your life, even though it seems like there shouldn't be, the easier and better and more successful your journey is going to be. And there's also a psychologist from Holocaust days named Viktor Frankel. And he went through the camps.
Yeah.
And I think his most famous premise is, if you have hope, you can get through anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So allow yourself hope and joy.
Man's Search for Meaning is one of Viktor Frankl's probably most well-known works, I would imagine. Definitely something to look into. But yeah, Fred, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your words.
My pleasure.
And whenever you do get that book published, feel free to reach out, come back on the show, and talk about it. Share it with people, and we'll have a deeper conversation about that and what you've gone through, I'm sure, with your neck surgery. I hope that is flawless as best it can be. I hope it goes as well as it can possibly go, because
Thank you.
Clearly you've got much more to do, and that can't be the end. But again, Fred, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
If you've listened to this as long as you have now, I appreciate you. I thank you for staying in touch with us, listening to me and Fred have go off on all our tangents. And I think we will see you next time on the Dylan Experience. So
thank you.
Of course. Too easy.